Welcome to Travels Through Time and to an episode supported by Sega. Hello, I'm Peter Moore. Today we're leaving our usual world of books and literature to one side for a moment as we explore how another industry is drawing on history in the present day. This is the world of gaming, of deeply immersive and, as I found out, expertly researched and assembled games that are introducing huge numbers of people to specific moments in the past. One of the most popular and acclaimed of these games over the past 2 decades is called Company of Heroes. This franchise began back in 2006 with a game set in 1944 and built around the events of Operation Overlord. A sequel dealing with the Red Army and the Eastern Front followed in 2013, and now, a decade on, a third game has been released. Company of Heroes 3 centres on the Mediterranean theatre of World War II, from Tobruk through to Monte Cassino. For me, as a working historian, this was a fabulous opportunity to find out how gamers are taking history and turning it into something really gripping and really quite new. What's more, as I'll explain later on, Company of Heroes 3 has been released along with a fascinating content hub or briefing room, which features analysis from world-renowned historians. First off though, the other day I sat down for a travel back through time with David Milne, a really impressive young mission builder who worked on the development of the game. I really enjoyed this conversation and I hope that you will do too. To see some wonderful visuals and videos and to learn more, do head to our website at tttpodcast.com. Welcome to Travels Through Time, David Milne. I'm in London. You're joining us from Vancouver, but we're, amongst other things, going to be talking about North Africa and India Day, so it's quite a cosmopolitan feel to this recording. But before we get to any of that, I just wanted to say that you pretty much have my 15-year-old self's dream job, and I thought it'd be good if you began by explaining to our listeners just what it is that you do.
Well, I've kind of got my 15-year-old self's dream job too, as it turns out. I am a senior game designer at Relic Entertainment. So more specifically, what I do is I am a mission designer. So I'm working on our single-player mission experiences. There's gameplay designers and systems designers and live ops. We've got all kinds of designers, and I'm specifically working on those single-player missions. So some places would call that like a level designer as well, if that's a term that people are more familiar with. But yeah.
That's you. Should I think of you as something like a digital novelist? You go into work in the morning, try and think up a plot line that would take a gamer through an exciting dramatic experience.
I mean, that's certainly a part of it. There is a lot of time where I'm designing, but it certainly looks like I'm just kind of staring out the window, thinking of what needs to be in the game and how to approach something. Certainly, we're focused on the experience that the player is having. What are they doing in their moment-to-moment playthrough? What is the actions they're performing? What are the challenges that they're up against? How do we teach players, how to solve these problems and then challenge their knowledge with, a more difficult version of that so they can apply that knowledge and kind of guiding them through that. So, yeah, and so in some ways, for sure, that's a large part of what we do.
And one other thing I just want to touch on from your biography is, and I think this is, because we're a history podcast, it's obviously very relevant, is the fact that you have studied history at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta. Is that right?
Yeah.
And do you want to tell me just a tiny bit about that and what the way was that took you from a history undergraduate degree into this very interesting job?
Yeah, I mean, history has been something that I've always been interested in. When I was a little kid, my dad and I would watch old old war movies, right? You know, The Longest Day and A Bridge Too Far and Tora, 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 and all those movies. That was our kind of Remembrance Day tradition. We'd sit and we'd watch all those movies on the History Channel, and even ones, you know, like Battle of the Bulge, as accurate or inaccurate as that movie might be. And so it you know, like that's always been something. And my dad actually has a history degree as well. He's a lawyer, but that's what his undergraduate was. And so like that respect for, I guess, or appreciation of history has always been something that's been the family. And games like Company of Heroes specifically, you know, when I was younger, and Age of Empires and Assassin's Creed just continued to pique that interest and get me wanting to like look into it more. And so when I got to university, I, like many 18-year-olds, didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I knew I liked history, and I knew that that was something that I would enjoy. And if nothing else, at least I would enjoy learning. I don't know. I didn't see myself going and getting a PhD and actually becoming, you know, a historian, you know, or writing a book. It was something that was always of interest to me, but I really wanted to be doing something that let me flex my creative muscles a little bit more. And so while I was at university, we had what were called GLER, or General Liberal Education Requirements. So you had to take a few classes that were outside of your major, which at the time I thought was very silly. And looking back, I actually think it's kind of a great idea, because what I did was I took a bunch of what were called back then new media classes. So this is animation and visual effects and 3D modeling and all that sort of stuff. And so I was taking history, but I was also taking, you know, these computer art classes effectively. And that got me in contact at that university with a group of people who were trying to make a video game. I kind of joined up with them, and it wasn't a part of a class or anything. They were just, you know, students trying to make a game. And I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. I was not really participating at all. I just thought, oh, I want to join in and this sounds cool. And then I realized that I didn't really understand any of it. And so I realized that I kind of needed an education in this in some capacity. So I started looking around, and I found the Vancouver Film School, which has a game design program. And so that's how I ended up here in Vancouver. Is I went to that school, took their program, and then ended up getting a job here in Vancouver. And a few years ago, because I was a fan of Company of Heroes and I knew Relic Entertainment was one of the companies in Vancouver, I always kind of kept my eye out on possible job openings for Relic. And a few years ago there was an opening, and I put my resume forward and did some design tests and got a job here. So, you know, working here and working on Company of Heroes in a lot of ways feels like a sort of coming full circle experience of, you know, being a young boy and having this interest in history and Company of Heroes specifically, and going through that journey. And now here I am, and I'm working on a Company of Heroes game.
Okay, well, keep your eyes out for any more jobs. You can tell me about them. Company of Heroes. Let's talk about the thing which brings us the great game which brings us here today. This is actually Company of Heroes 3.
Mm-hmm.
I know that this is a tremendously popular franchise which has sold in the millions over the past decade and a half or so, but I thought it'd be really useful if you gave our listeners an overview of what Company of Heroes is for those who maybe don't know yet, and also tell us if there is some realization on your part of why it has been quite so popular.
So Company of Heroes is what we call a real-time strategy game. So if you're thinking about your view or your perspective on it, it's a camera that's kind of hovering above the world, looking down on it, and you build up a base, and you build up an army of squads of riflemen and tanks and weapons teams and that kind of stuff, and you are controlling them. It's a tactics game as much as anything. You're moving your units around, you're putting them in cover, you're trying to capture specific locations or destroy certain things depending on what the objective is. You can play through our single player campaigns, which for this game we have a campaign where you play as the Africa Corps in North Africa, and another campaign where you play as the British and the Americans, starting in Salerno and moving their way up to Rome in Italy. And then, of course, you can play multiplayer as well, and that's where a huge chunk of our fans latch onto as well, is playing against each other in kind of competitive player versus player, Axis versus Allies fights. Again, really stretching those tactical and strategic muscles that they might have to see who's the better commander. So yeah, and you said it. This is a Company of Heroes 3. It's been around since the early 2000s, and I think that one of the things that draws players in and really captures players, one is that gameplay that I described. It's you're controlling kind of, let's say, large platoon to small company size of units. The gameplay loop of that kind of boots on the ground, you're moving your units around, you're thinking about how to flank an enemy machine gun team, dropping smoke, smashing tanks through walls to open up new flanking routes and that sort of a thing. Like the action and the gameplay of the game itself, I think, is what really draws it in. But there's sort of another element to it, which is we have this real focus on character and making sure that our world feels very alive. When you zoom in on these characters, they're fully animated, and we actually write up for each of our unit types. We'll write up a biography for them, and when we cast their voice actors, we're casting a character. And so as you click on them and send them places, they're talking, they're bantering with each other, they're shouting at the enemy, they're reacting to explosions and gunfire around them, and so it feels very alive. You feel attached to these characters. They're not just little green plastic army men. It's your units. They're your squads, and you feel that attachment, and you feel pulled in by that. And I think that that's what really, really draws players in.
It's really fascinating hearing you describe that. And I think again of what I said earlier about the novelistic aspect of this, because it is very, very immersive. You're thinking about the individual here, and it's down to that level. But there's a word I wanted to dwell on, if you don't mind, from the title, which I think is an instructive one as well, the word company, because I suppose to a lot of people that suggests the kinship of, the band of brothers kind of thing, and people thrown together in combat, but actually takes us to something else as well that I've heard you talk about elsewhere, which is the community of gamers who've come together around Company of Heroes. And we're talking about, this is number 3 in 15 years or so. It's taken a long time to develop this particular game, and you talk about the community being involved in the developmental aspect of that. Is that true?
Yeah, so from a very early stage, we've had some amount of community involvement. So that has included a group of people who were either content creators or professional players, and trying to get early designs and early builds of the game in their hands, and wanting to get that feedback very early on. This is a game that has been around for a long time, and we want to make sure that we're making a game that the players wanted. This is for them. So we want to make sure that it's hitting the right kind of level of gameplay and tactical depth and all of those things. And so there's a period of time where it was a somewhat smaller group that we were working with, and then I'd have to check the dates, but a year and a half maybe before launch, we announced the game, and we announced it with a playable build of the game, and anybody could basically, they signed up to our forums so that they could leave feedback, and then they got access to a version of our game, and we've been posting things and getting feedback, this whole time. And so, as we've really been doing our best to try to work with players.
And do you find that people are hugely invested in this to the point where, they really care about you getting small details right, or they get very cross if you get a small detail wrong?
Oh, yes. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's there is sometimes the need to balance expectations, we'll say. There are certain aspects, again, because of the medium and because it is a video game, there are aspects that are inherently inaccurate, when it comes to, say, the factions themselves and the units that we put in the factions, or that we decide to put in the factions. On one hand, we want to try to be as historically accurate, or at least as authentic as we can be. But at the same time, these factions, the British and the Americans and the Wehrmacht and the Afrika Korps, they have to play multiplayer against each other. So they have to be balanced in some way. And so the idea of balancing a a relatively early war Africa Corps against a somewhat later war US or Wehrmacht army means that you kind of have to shift the numbers a little bit in terms of the damage that certain units can deal and they can take, and speeds and stuff, because there has to be some level of parity between these factions. And so yeah, there are some numbers we have to fudge sometimes when it comes to these things, and players are always willing to point that out to us. But it's it's a part of the conversation, and I'll always take a player who's invested enough to point out our inaccuracies over a player that looks at it and just goes, okay, whatever, doesn't care, right? So it's always, I mean, I was that player at one point, right? So there are tons and tons of invested players, but that's a good thing.
It certainly is. Let's bring this back to you then now, and your role as someone who designs missions. Can you tell us a little bit, because what we're going to do actually very shortly is delve into a few of these different missions on a spin on our usual format. I'll explain more about that in a moment, but just for the moment, we'll just give an overview really of how these missions emerge. Do you sit down with a piece of white paper or is it maybe a particular bit of source material that engages you? How does it go?
There's sort of a couple routes that we can come from. In some cases, it comes from kind of what you said, this idea of, we know that this is an important battle historically, so we want to try to represent it some way, and so going and doing that research. And then the other way is more of a gameplay need, right? So when you're playing the Italian campaign, it is a map of Italy. We have this grand strategy layer, and so it is a map of Italy that you're looking at. You're moving your armies around to attack certain locations. Then say if you attack Monte Cassino or Ortona, you then go down to that tactical layer and you play Ortona. And so in some cases we needed to have, a certain number of missions spread around the map so that there was kind of the right density of missions. And then in some cases, for instance, Monte Cassino, we really want to make sure we do a mission around Monte Cassino or Ortona or Anzio, because these are quite famous battles. And so we want to make sure that we're representing those. So that's kind of how we choose what missions we're doing. But when it comes to actually creating them, it starts out with, because this is historically based, it starts out with a lot of research. It starts with we've got a little library at Relic with a lot of history books in it, and we're reading that. We're looking for things on the internet. There was a period of time where a big part of my job was just watching documentaries and trying to absorb as much information and as many different accounts of the battles and different perspectives on the battles as possible, and doing things like looking at aerial photography. The Allies took a lot of aerial photography, and so that we can see the layouts of these cities and these battles, and personal accounts wherever we can find them. And so you're doing all of that research, and then we first do a paper plan. So we do kind of a one-pager pitch of like, this is what the mission is going to be. These are the things I'm going to focus on. Then we do kind of a larger pitch that has multiple layouts and versions of the layouts and stuff. And then we all get together as a group, and there's lots of iteration. We usually decide on one of the three layouts, or what happens most of the time is we decide on part of layout A and part of layout B and part of layout C, and we kind of merge them together. And then, then we get into the engine and we start building it out as a gray box and scripting it all and iterating and iterating and iterating for a very long time until we have that final project. But one of the things that we do, and one of the reasons why we look at as many kind of different perspectives as we can on these battles, is because, and this is maybe what we'll talk about in a minute here, is the need to kind of boil down the history to its essentials, because we only have so much time in a mission and so much space in a mission to represent some of these battles. And so it's important that we find out from the history, like, what about Monte Cassino or Ortona or Anzio or Tobruk makes that battle what it was? What makes it recognizable as that battle? Because we have to really hone in on that, because we kind of have a limited space to represent the battle. So it has to be something that you look at and go, that's Monte Cassino. This is the battle that I'm fighting right now, and make sure that we understand what the essentials of that history is.
That's a really good explanation. Well, let's go and have a look at this in practice then. So usually at this point, I ask people if they was to travel back through time, which year they would pick. But today we're going to do something a little bit different, which gives us freedom to really explore a few of these different missions and connect them together with the history that people might know generally. I suppose it'll give us a sense of your process and what they would get if they were to have a go on the game itself. And so I'll ask a different question today, which is I'm going to give you an opportunity to go back to a battle. We've got 2 more to come after this, but where would you like to go to first?
So first we're going to go to the Second Battle of Tobruk, so June 1942, North Africa.
I was trying to think of a way to quickly distill this is, as you said before, a hugely complex history because there's all sorts going on. But if we were to try and make it legible very quickly to listeners today, what's happening in Bakhmut at the moment in Ukraine is similar in the sense that you've got this siege of a particular place which has become a symbol of heroic resistance. And that's pretty much what happened with Tobruk through 1941 into 1942, isn't it? Until June, at least, when things changed, because the British had held on. Is that right?
So it is from the Axis perspective. So this is the Second Battle of Tobruk, or the fall of Tobruk. So the Afrika Korps has pushed their way into Libya and then been pushed back, and now they're pushing forward again. It's part of that seesaw kind of action that was happening in North Africa. And so the battle of, I suppose what's happened immediately, if we're back in that period of time, the Gazala has occurred, and the British are sort of falling back at this point. And the siege of Tobruk was, this real high point, I would say, for the Allies. It was this, you said it yourself, this heroic stand of being able to hold on against all odds. And so Tobruk itself is very sort of, I'd say, kind of politically important as a symbol. But the Gazala line is where the Allies kind of thought that they were going to have a jumping off point for their own offensive, and then things got turned around on them. So what's happened here is that there's a somewhat rushed fallback to Tobruk at this point, and many of much of the British Army is actually falling back even further, and so there's a garrison left at Tobruk to hold it, and there's kind of this back and forth of, okay, how do we hold it and how much do we hold it? And so even though there's this idea of Tobruk being this besieged city, the defenses around the city aren't quite what they were during the first battle. I heard some accounts that sappers were going out and desperately trying to repair the defenses, that were at one point the actually Italian defenses that the Australians took over during the siege, and trying to repair them because there's this giant anti-tank ditch that was surrounding the city, and it had been destroyed in certain places and filled in with sand, and so they're trying to repair it, and they're trying to get minefields up, and they're trying to rebuild those defenses that existed, but it wasn't quite enough. The city was quickly surrounded by the Afrika Korps, and then almost a day, effectively, once the attack began, the attack was pretty much over, and they were surrounded, and the British attempted to break out a little bit, but that didn't work. They didn't quite have the same level of support that they did last time. They weren't prepared for this kind of a siege, and it ended up being, one of the biggest captures or surrenders of British troops, I think, since Singapore, I think, is actually the biggest one. But this was a massive loss, both in terms of material, in terms of personnel, in terms of the propaganda aspect of it.
And it came as a tremendous shock. I know Churchill was said to have gone white when he heard the news and was completely devastated. Is that right?
Yeah, he in particular was. I believe it actually caused a political scandal. There were calls for Churchill to step down, although admittedly there's almost always calls for Churchill to step down from someone.
And on the flip side, we have Rommel, whose reputation is really made at this point as the Desert Fox, and he is seen almost as an immortal military figure at this point, at least.
This is probably the high point of the Rommel hype, we could say. And capturing Tobruk had real logistical implications as well. One of the reasons why the first push of the Africa Corps kind of failed is because they didn't have that supply depot at Tobruk. It was being held, and Tobruk was being used as a supply depot for the Allies' planned attack from Ghazal, and so the Africa Corps captured all kinds of food and fuel and things like socks. I remember soldiers being very happy about all the socks they found in Tobruk, and that alone kind of helped Rommel's impetus to continue forward onto El Alamein and push even further forward from there.
You have this hugely loaded historical moment. As you say, it all comes down to this day. I think it's the 20th of June. People will tell me if I've got that wrong. In 1942, when it all goes wrong. You said something interesting before. I'm going to let you talk about the mission as well in a moment, because I'm interested to see how you built a mission out of this historical context. But you said about point of view, because you're kind of playing from the Axis point of view here, which is something, maybe this shows my age, but I'm not even sure you're allowed to do that in the 1990s. You were forced into the one particular side. But at least one thing that I was thinking about is it's really interesting that we're looking at war from different points of view now. And even with films like All Quiet on the Western Front, we're being challenged to our quite orthodox views of being on this side or that side, and it seems to be something you're doing as well.
Yeah, we wanted to be able to show both perspectives. There's a real interest for it. I mean, going back to talking to our players and seeing what they wanted to see. The Africa Corps is a faction. So the Africa Corps is a new faction for this version of the game, for Company of Heroes 3, and that's something that players had been asking for a long time, and so because we're adding this new faction in, we wanted to feature them in a campaign and make them playable and kind of tell the story from that moment, because as we just discussed with Tobruk, there are some truly amazing, huge battles from that perspective. So yeah, being able to use the Africa Corps and sort of that technology and the way that we framed that faction was a really interesting perspective to take.
So tell me about how this mission, which is related to this particular battle, plays out.
So when I was researching this mission, the one thing that I really kind of locked into, again, we talk about the essentials of it and certainly the emotion of it and sort of the action. What sort of actions can the player take while they're playing the game? Because the game itself is all about player action. And so something that I focused on was the speed of it. It happened so quickly. They got surrounded and then the lines were just broken through. And so when you look at the layout of the map, we put in that big tank ditch, but there are holes in it because it hasn't been repaired properly. And there are tons of British defenses, but if you break through at certain points, they'll actually fall back to the next point, right? So it's all about pushing that line back. You're fighting against an entrenched, British force, but you're trying to strike them at certain positions to force them to fall back. And so when you look at the layout, you start at sort of a represent. It's not actually El Adem, but it's kind of a representation of El Adem, where you get a bunch of fuel resources and you get a base built up sort of for you, so you're almost immediately ready to go. You can build your tanks, you can build your infantry up, and you're ready to just go in almost as this highly mobile vehicle-based shock army and push through. Those defenses, actually, you can still see them on Google Earth. If you look at them, you can actually zoom in and you can see the jagged trench line that still surrounds Tobruk in North Africa today. And a lot of the British, they're sort of pill-shaped defensive slit trenches and stuff. It's so that, a lot of that is what this layout is based on, is based on the actual layout or an approximation of, in our mission space of that. And so as you're going through the mission, you're hitting the British and you're forcing them to fall back at certain points. And they're attacking back at you with armor as much as they can. There were armored counterattacks, but they were scattered and kind of ineffective because of how quickly this was all coming on. And of course, the Italians were fighting on different points of the line, causing distractions and stuff while the spearhead of the Africa Corps went in. As you look at the layout of this map, there's kind of large open spaces for tanks to fight that get kind of pushed through these choke points of breaches in the trench or in that tank ditch, or like the certain trench networks of the British that you're fighting kind of toward, and then trying to get around and behind as well. And then once you've done that, they fall back into the city itself, and you actually surround the city, and there are attempts by the British. It becomes almost a defensive mission at that point for you, because you're now defending a line and trying to prevent the British from breaking out. And so there are armored counterattacks against you while you're sort of holding this line. The objective at that point is that you fail the mission if too many British units are actually able to escape, because they'll reform and attack you again. And so that's kind of the overview of the mission. But the focus was to try and focus on that speed and attacking those defenses, and then surrounding and preventing a British breakout, and as sort of the essentials of what you think about when you think about that battle, and kind of forming that into 2 or 3 objectives that the player can complete on the map as a representation.
The map sounds pretty vast, actually. I mean, it must have taken a hell of a lot of development, which I'm sure you could tell me about at length. But from the player's point of view, if you would sit down, make yourself comfortable in the chair and fancy heading back to 1942 to have a go at Tobruk, what kind of length of time are we talking about? Are you going to be in that chair for a week, a day? What kind of length of time might a mission like this take?
So our aim for mission was always 45 minutes to an hour. For some missions like this, they certainly take longer. I would say the average is probably a bit over an hour for a game or for a mission like this. And that's sort of one of the places that the abstraction of the history starts to come from is, and probably Tobruk is because of how quickly this battle happened, it's probably one of the missions we have that does sort of more closely, directly relate to the history, just because of how quickly that battle happened. But a couple of the battles we're going to talk about here are more of an abstraction, because, they still also have to be 45 minutes to an hour. And, there are battles in World War II that lasted weeks or even months. And so having to boil that down, you have to make some hard choices about what exactly you're going to represent in the mission.
Brilliant. I'm really hoping we can get some visuals actually from you to put on our website so people can have a look at just how much detail goes into this. And it strikes me that that's a lot of the pleasure of the playing comes from the fine details, and then the idea of immersion on top of that must be something. But we're going to go from these vast deserts, searing light and blue skies. Next 2 battles are going to take place in quite a different geographical terrain, because of course in September of 1943 the British and the Americans make this hop. It's a bit more than a hop, but they go to Italy anyway. It's the Allied invasion of Italy. And so the next 2 battles that we're going to talk about take place as part of that Italian campaign that runs through. So we've gone from 1942, and very neatly for us, you're going to give us one in 1943 and one in 1944 to finish with. So let's go to the 1943 battle and see how you've interacted with that one as well. Which one have you picked, please?
So it was December 1943 and the Battle of Ortona. So the Canadian forces going up the eastern coast of Italy and capturing Ortona.
Yeah, I suppose we should emphasise, based on your background, that this is a bit of a Canadian story. Was it a good one for you did you get into it, have a sense of patriotic pride or something?
I certainly did, and I'll explain exactly how in a minute here. But it was definitely, certainly when it comes to the history of it, we are a Canadian studio. I'm Canadian myself, and so it's certainly there was an aspect of really wanting to make sure that we were able to represent the Canadians and get them in there, and because Ortona is kind of this distinctly Canadian battle. It's referred to as Little Stalingrad by some people, just for the ferocity of the house-to-house fighting, and we wanted to make sure that we were representing that.
So
representing Canadians.
Absolutely. But to sketch the history then, the landings were opposed, but, they kind of, the Allies certainly did make substantial gains, but everything came to a bit of a stalemate after a short while because of the terrain. I want to talk to you about the terrain a little bit later on, so we'll leave that for the moment. But if you want to imagine what's going on with this particular battle. It's on the Adriatic coast, isn't it, rather than the Mediterranean coast? Is that the correct way to put it? And and it's very ferocious, street to street, lots of snipers, lots of ruined buildings. If you could imagine, I suppose, a completely ruined community, this is what it was, isn't it?
Yeah, it was destroyed. Almost front to back, a ruin, a city of ruins, and done with purpose. It was a city that the Germans really intended to hold, or at least use to significantly slow down the Allied advance. And so they dug in. They were destroying buildings just to block roads and create their own sort of defenses out of the ruins and the rubble. And it took a lot of very vicious, I say street to street, but house to house in a lot of cases. There was a tactic employed there called mouse holing, where you would go into one, instead of trying to cross the street or go down the street, you would go into one building, go to the top floor of it, blast a hole through the wall into the next building, and go in through the top of the next building and back down again. And they would do this sort of zigzag up and down through the buildings to clear out all of the garrisoned units. It was that kind of fighting. I even read one report of them taking mortar tubes and effectively firing them at very, very low angles, kind of from one building into another building, rather than the typical, artillery arc that you would see a mortar use. I mean, it's all kinds of just very sort of vicious, in close fighting. But eventually they prevailed. They managed to push their way through, and the Germans eventually had to retreat and fall back from there to another defensive line.
Hello, it's Peter here. As you can tell from my conversation with David Milne, I thoroughly enjoyed this opportunity to find out more about Company of Heroes 3. It was released just a month ago at the end of February to a blaze of 5-star reviews. Gaming Trend called it a masterpiece. The reviewer for the NME described it as a fiercely intelligent real-time strategy game that drowns players in interesting choices, and it could just be one of my favourite RTS games ever. Now, as I said earlier, for you real history lovers, Company of Heroes 3 has been issued along with an accompanying website called The Briefing Room. Here, you can learn about all sorts of things like the reality of desert warfare, the tactics that the different forces employed, and the weapons that they used. It includes biographies of key figures and gives you access to an enthralling range of immersive and interactive maps. You can hear from experts like Professor Simon Ball on Alamein or Matthew Parker on Monte Cassino, and even from one of our old time travellers, Robert Lyman, who gives an elegant overview of the Battle of Tobruk. To find out much more about this, just go to history.companyofheroes.com.
Waiting orders, sir.
So it's a good opportunity for me to ask you about weaponry, because I know that it has many points of difference, doesn't it, with Tobruk? Because in Tobruk it's this lightning fast assault, the city falls, it's a shocking moment, whereas this is more prolonged. The fighting is at very close quarters, probably involves slightly different weapons as well, and techniques, as you alluded to there. Do you want to talk about any of the particular weapons that feature in this mission?
Absolutely. So when the player plays any of these missions, in the Italian campaign, they actually have a choice of what nationality and what faction they use. So they could be American or British, and then within American and British, there's the American Armored Company, the American Airborne, like the paratroopers, and the American, First Special Forces, the SSF commandos. And then as the British, you have armored support, and you have the Indian Artillery Company as well. And so that's actually a part of sort of the almost ahistorical nature as well, is we set up the game as close to the history as we can, but at the same time, the player has agency, and they have choice, and they have options. And so as much as we try to represent that history, there's also an element of a sort of what if question, right? What if I was here? What if I was the commander of this theater, and where do I put my units, and where do I allocate them? On that note, though, one of the things that when you come into Ortona, the weaponry and the abilities and stuff that you have access to kind of depends on who you bring in. So if there is, a machine gun team in a building watching over an intersection, as they would, it's up to you to solve that problem. So you can use mortars to hit it from a long way away. You can call in an airstrike. You could throw smoke grenades and have your infantry approach much more closely, that sort of a thing. We set up the problems for the player to solve to be kind of based in that history, but then it's up to the player to decide whether they're going to follow that history and kind of play it out as a reenactment, or if they're going to see what would work better or different, or what would I do in this situation. And that, I think, is a part of, we go back to what we talked about before, a part of that fun of the game and what draws people in is that idea of how do I do things differently. There are a couple units, though, that we feature specifically in Ortona. Their use is particular for this kind of combat. One is a Churchill crocodile, so a Churchill flame tank. So you have this big, heavy, slow-moving infantry tank that's able to kind of crawl through these narrow streets and burnt-out buildings and try to push the Germans off of intersections or out of houses and stuff. And if you play as the Americans, you get a Sherman bulldozer tank. So it's got a howitzer cannon on it, and it's got a big bulldozer. There's a lot of walls that you can just break through a wall and create a new path for yourself and take down a building to be able to go through it. And destruction becomes one of the mechanics that you're playing with in that mission, because you need to find new routes through the city as it's the Germans have concentrated their forces on these choke points, on these narrow streets. The city itself, when you look at the map, it's ruins, it's narrow streets. It's very claustrophobic. It's certainly when you compare it to a map like Tobruk. Units, you can be walking down a street and units are firing at you from above, on higher, floors of a building, and there's little tiny infantry flanking routes. And so, the tanks kind of need to stay on these main roads, but you need to make sure you have infantry surrounding them to support them, because they could quickly get stuck or surrounded. And so that's an aspect of it. The other unit that we featured was a squad of Canadian infantry. That was something I really wanted to make sure we got in the game. We actually created a new infantry squad for this mission. They're Canadian shock troopers, so they're a heavy infantry squad equipped with Thompson submachine guns and demolition charges. And the reason we do that is to kind of pay homage to that idea of mouse holing. Now, we don't have the mechanics to actually allow the player to go into one building and blow a hole into the next building and go down. That's just mechanics wise something that we wouldn't be able to do, but they can still breach into buildings and use their demolition charges to destroy buildings and obstacles and that sort of thing. So we're still kind of paying homage to that idea of them being these close-in shock troops / demolition experts as they go through this mission.
I'm just sitting here with a bit of a look of wonder on my face, because it all sounds incredibly compelling. And I suppose you've in a way answered this question already, which is one that I wanted to put to you, which is what peculiar little nugget of knowledge did you come away with which would stay with you? I suppose it must be this idea of mouse holing and moving through buildings, and I'm not sure what use this will be to you in day-to-day life, maybe one day, who knows. But is there anything else that you want to talk about from this developmental work that you've done here that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Certainly, in the way the Canadians were used in the mission. So I said, we sort of focused on the Canadians quite a bit here, mostly for the love of who we are, I suppose, and the pride, the national pride, I guess is the word I'm looking for. But on that Italian campaign map, there's actually a quest to help out the Canadians, and you help them out in a city nearby Ortona. And if you do that, then in the Ortona mission, you will actually gain access to these Canadian units. It's like you've gained their support, and then you can call them in. So there are decisions on the campaign map that will actually affect the missions themselves and how they play. And as well as that, the Canadians are actually there as a computer, like an AI-controlled allied faction as well. So regardless of whether you have access to them, to the Canadian shock troopers yourself, they're always there in the mission, and they're kind of fighting this battle on the flanks. And so I said, you can be ahistorical in terms of you could bring an American company in to fight at Ortona. But I really wanted to make sure the Canadians were always there. It is still a Canadian battle, and you're there to support their advance, and they're there to support your advance. It becomes a joint thing because the Canadians are always going to be there fighting. And so even though there is an ahistorical nature to that, that's not really how the battle went. We're trying to keep that connection to the history by saying, no, this is a Canadian battle. The Canadians are here. They're fighting with you, and you can do that. And you at one point, there's an objective. Some squads get pinned down, and you go and you take out these HMG teams. They're like, thanks, we'll try to flank around the outside. And then later in the mission, a whole bunch of enemies come in, but then they kind of come through too, and they're helping you out. And so it becomes this really sort of, we try to really feature them, and you're the player, and of course you're the one with agency and with the driving force, but the Canadian troops get to kind of be the heroes in that mission as well, even though they're AI controlled.
So we've had one Canadian victory, one British defeat. So let's see what's going to happen next. So we've got one more of these, the third and our final battle to have a look at. It's another absolutely fascinating historical context. So tell us what the battle is, and tell us how this situation came about, please.
What I'm talking about next is the Battle of Anzio, which is interesting to call it a Battle of Anzio, because really it was from January to June, I believe, is how long the beachhead lasted. And it was actually now a new front line has been opened effectively. But what happened is the Allies you kind of mentioned before, the Allies were getting bogged down. Italy is this long, skinny nation. They thought, well, if we could just land troops behind the line, we could maybe force the Germans to back up again, rather than having to break through this. And so there's a bit of a rush happening here because the invasion of Normandy is coming. And so many, many troops, and certainly the equipment to land troops amphibiously, is being earmarked for that invasion. And so there's a time frame. It has to be done very quickly. And so they plan this invasion. They're going to land at Anzio, and they do. They land up the coast. It's relatively unopposed because the Germans didn't quite expect that. But then there was, so the story goes, some hesitation. Lucas, I believe, was the general in charge, and he hesitated, and he built up a pretty huge number of troops at the bridgehead, but didn't press his advantage. He didn't move out, and so the Germans had time to counterattack. And what began was effectively this almost siege, where the troops that are the Americans who are there, and British as well, are basically just have to hold this beachhead. They're being hit by artillery, and Germans are bringing in railway guns, and there are pretty significant tank battles as well on some of the edges. And there's this, it becomes yet another just static line of attrition that is formed in Italy. That is sort of where this mission comes from. Eventually they break out and they plan a new operation, which is attack simultaneously from the line at Monte Cassino and the line at Anzio, and they break through and come together.
You've done some great distillation. I mean, it is really interesting, though, I think, the Anzio enclave, that it becomes separated from the rest of the Allied forces. And one thing actually I might add to our website, because it's such a fun little educational video. I don't know if you've seen this, but there was a 1960 documentary about the Anzio thing, and it's just called the Beachhead or something like this. And it describes this strange little, I suppose, society adrift, like a island in the ocean or something like that, trying to remain entire until it's rescued. Just the way that this developed, as you said exactly, that the landings are relatively unopposed, but then it becomes very attritional and very, very bloody thereafter. And you get this sense of people digging holes, and it becomes quite fantastic Mr. Foxish, where people are living underground and like kind of boring little holes up and things. And I thought, well, if you're going to sit down and want to put that into a game, then this is a wonderful, wonderful context for you.
That's actually what I was going to bring up in a moment, is, all these images you see of tents, kind of the standard army tent that they would have, but it's half underground. So you just have the little the little top of the tent up because they've built dirt up so high over the sides to help guard against, shrapnel and the side effects of artillery. They're like, there's nowhere to go. You couldn't back up. The Mediterranean was behind you, and so they just had to go down. If you look, our environment artists, who are so talented, I just can't talk enough about how talented they are. If you look at the map of Anzio on the beachhead that you initially need to defend, if you look around, there are little entrances to underground areas, and there are ruins, but there's also, things built up around, your defensive buildings. And there's even little details like entrances to an underground area. You'll just see, a table and chairs and cards on it and a little string of laundry, because they're living here. It's, it's those details that they didn't just show up and start fighting. They had to live. They had to do their laundry. They wanted to play cards sometimes. There was, they needed off time, even though they are almost constantly within range of enemy artillery. There was nowhere for them to go. And so you just see some of those aspects of, even in a horrific event like this, troops just kind of getting on with it. and just, okay, well, this
putting
is the situation we're in now.
Yeah,
well, I got, yes, the artillery's hitting, but I have dirty socks. Yeah. So, I just got to do what are you going to do? You got to do your laundry. So some of the detail, those little details, if you look for them, you'll find them in a lot of these maps and missions as well. We try to, a lot of those details come from the environment artists, and they try to really make the environments feel lived in and real. And these are places.
It's the domestic details as well as the military ones, isn't it? And so we talked before about the obvious question of weaponry. But yeah, I think there is something nice about seeing the little foxholes and signs of, just food and sleeping and all these little ever-present aspects of life that we all have. And we've now got, I suppose, as far away from the one day in Tobruk as we possibly can, because this is a 6-month, process. What kind of a mission would you put into that? If you approach that, what do you think about?
Yeah, I really had to think about what exactly we wanted to represent here and how to represent that, because like I said, it's really kind of a series of battles. There's really different stages to the Battle of Anzio. And so this is probably the mission where maybe the most abstraction is happening. So in the mission itself, what happens is you go on the beaches, and the impression is that this battle has already been going on for a little while. Like I say, you go on the beach and they're already, you see people are already dug in. There's allies on the beach already fighting. Some of the buildings at Anzio have been destroyed and ruined. So you're kind of the next push, let's say, as you come in. So the very first thing you do is defend the beach. Artillery is coming in, the Germans are attacking, it's a defensive beat, and you just have to hold the line. And so I'm trying to take that siege aspect of the Battle of Anzio and make that a focus of it right away, of you are being hit by artillery, there's enemy infantry incoming, and you just have to hold that line. And you just have to hold it until a break comes, and you can maybe push out. And then once you've held off, you have this opportunity to try and push out again, and the Germans will keep attacking you. But also, one of the unique units I got for this mission was a railway gun. So one of the German K5, big railway guns. So it's referred to in the mission as Anzio Annie, even though the Germans wouldn't have referred to it as that. But it is from the Allied perspective, so we're referring to it from the Allied point of view. And what's happening in the mission is, as you're pushing out and as you're driving forward, there are hills and there are kind of river valleys and stuff that you're pushing out on, and the Germans are dug into the side of the hills, kind of reverse slope like they would, and hiding, counterattacking vehicles and stuff in high, treed or well hedged areas and stuff to try to catch you off guard. The railway gun is firing at your base the whole time this is happening, and so there's effectively a timer on your mission. You have to get to that railway gun and break through this German defensive line before that railway gun destroys your base. And so there's this anxiety and this a little bit of pressure now that is put on the player of like, you have to move fast, you have to push out, you have to get through this line, because it's just on a timer. It's just hitting you now, hitting you. And so trying to capture that emotion of the constant and consistent artillery fire that they had to, endure while at Anzio is a part of this mission, and is being represented as effectively a timer that you have to outrun as you push up the map, which is itself actually also a very big very big map. There was no way to not make this a pretty big mission. You get to kind of a town, another town beyond. So there's Anzio, and then there's a lot of German defenses and hills and stuff, and then another town where the railway gun is, and you clear the Germans out of that, and it's kind of the final defensive line. And once you break through that, the mission is successful. But there's a couple other aspects that I added to it as well. One is, once you get up the coast a little bit and you push forward, there's actually another Allied landing happening, which happened. The Americans landed at Anzio and Nettuno, and the British actually landed up the coast a little bit. In this mission, if you land as the Americans, it's the British up the coast a little bit, and they are trapped on the beaches, but you're coming from behind. And so if you get there fast enough, you can destroy the machine guns and the anti-tank guns that are holding them on the beach, and then they'll actually help you push through the line as well. And then if you come into that mission as the British, it's the Americans up the coast. And so, because this was a joint operation, I wanted to make sure that both, Allied powers were kind of represented in this mission as well, kind of helping you fight. And so, yeah, there's little details that we try to add and try to represent, but it ends up being a very intense mission.
You alluded to this earlier on, and just wanted to pick up on it. And it's this idea of, you depict the local, you're maybe hovering above the action at 50 feet or whatever it might be. But there's also a way of looking from further up, if you like, over maybe Italy as a whole, and seeing something that was so central to that Italian campaign, which is the really difficult nature of the terrain. I remember one veteran once said there was only two ways that you could go, uphill and downhill, or the only thing that would, what did they say? There's a lovely quote which I've got. What you need to fight an army over this ground is an army of bulletproof kangaroos, which is just this kind of idea of it being so difficult to manage. And can you get that as well within the gameplay?
Absolutely, yeah. There's all sorts of different terrain that we represent. So Ortona's up on a hill, and it's this extremely dense urban environment. Anzio itself is actually kind of on a more open area of Italy, but then we have other missions as well. I think probably the more famous one would be Monte Cassino, and what you're doing in that mission is you are fighting up a mountain. There's a mechanical representation of having the height advantage. So we have cover in our game. If your units are behind rubble or behind sandbags, they'll actually take less damage and be harder to hit. But if a unit is above you, it negates that cover advantage. And so as you're fighting up the hill, you're fighting up at a disadvantage. And the heavily entrenched Germans as you're moving up this hill is represented. And there are other maps as well. One of the missions I did was Potenza, which was itself, they kind of came out. It was actually Canadians as well in this case. You come out of this river valley, and then you have to cross a river, and the whole city itself is on a hill, and it's almost this kind of bean shape, concave shape. And so there were guns and machine guns and stuff almost sort of facing out like a amphitheater, and having to go up in these very narrow crisscrossing. So it's both a hill and it's urban environment, because you have switchback roads with buildings and stuff lining them that enemies are garrisoned inside, and the kind of narrow close fighting where a single machine gun squad or a single anti-tank gun can hold up your whole army if you kind of make the wrong move. And so there's a lot of this very fighting against these entrenched enemies, on hills, on mountains, and cities, and all over the place.
It's Oh, goodness. I could talk to you about this all day. Unfortunately, our time has run a little bit short, but I do have one last question I want to put to you before I let you go. Hopefully a fun one. All these things are strewn out over the map, and if I gave you the opportunity to reach your hand out metaphorically and pick up a tangible memento of this conversation today from one of the 3 battles, is there anything you'd like as a bit of a talisman?
I really liked this question. I think it's a really interesting one. It's been on my mind actually a lot for the last few days because it's hard. It's a hard one to pick. So if you'll humor me, I'll talk you through my mental process here of like how I got to it. But yeah, because there's so much you could bring back. We've talked about, I mean, we're covering altogether, I mean, years of conflict. And so, my initial thought was kind of the things that you typically bring back from a battlefield, or that soldiers, a pistol or a rank insignia or a flag or something like that. But, I didn't fight there. So that seems weirdly like looting rather than a trophy kind of thing. And then I was thinking about that more, and I wanted it to be a bit more maybe sentimental. And I thought about what about a piece of rubble from Ortona, or some of the sand from the beach of Anzio, but that I don't know, that didn't quite hit for me. But what I was started thinking about, because I was looking at because of this podcast, I was looking back at some of the documentation that I had done about these, and I was looking at all these maps, and we have maps now in hindsight where you see there's a map of Italy and here's the line, and we know exactly who's on one side of the line and exactly who's on the other side of the line. That's not how it was, right? They were working with incomplete information. And so the idea of getting your hands on a map or something that was like just a captain's map of a local area that he'd scribbled on to say, okay, well, there's something here, and we know there's a gun here, and there's probably this, having that snapshot of like the incomplete information that they actually had, and having to like make very serious decisions based on it. They have intelligence, of course, but it's intelligence. It's not confirmed all the time, and surprises happen. And just thinking about that experience, and that close to the ground, that personal experience, got me thinking about my great uncle David Milne. He's my namesake. He was a lieutenant of a machine gun section in World War I, and he wrote a war journal, a diary, and I have that. It's one of the few items in my possession that I would probably classify as treasured. I make a yearly sort of tradition out of reading it on Remembrance Day. That's sort of my thing that I do to remember him. And reading it's funny kind of how mundane it is most of the time, actually. Reading it doesn't turn your understanding of World War I history on its head or reveal anything new. It's just, his recollections and remembering, but it's such a personal connection, I think, and such a really wonderful way to remember him. And so the thing that I think I would want to bring back, and maybe I'm cheating a little bit when I say this, is if you transported me back in a time machine, I would just try to pick up every lost journal that is lost to time, and that we've lost, every accounting that a soldier has made, and every little bit of life that they decided to write down and record for posterity that hasn't made it to us now. I really love reading those things, and reading them isn't, like I say, it's probably not going to change our understanding of World War II, or there's not going to be some major reveal. And probably things you read in, like things I read in my uncle's war journal are probably things that were written in so many other war journals as well, the day-to-day life of soldiering. But it's still such a personal connection, and there's going to be those little bits of personal connection there. And so I would want to go back and bring some of those people, I guess, back with me, as many as I could find and as many as I could grab. That's what I would want.
Wonderful answer. And I think what's really clear to me talking to you today is the passion with which you've done this work, the care with which you've approached it. And there's a real kind of sense of the importance of history, but also the playfulness I think that we always try and encourage when we're talking to people in the podcast as well, which is something that doesn't just take you back to the history, but also brings it back to us today. And I think I'll swap you all of those memoirs for a a copy of Company's Heroes 3, and our listeners will probably never hear from me ever again because I'll vanish into some lost space. But listen, I've enjoyed this tremendously. I've learned a lot, and I hope you have enjoyed it as well. Thank you very much for coming on Travel Through Time, David Milne.
Thank you for having me. I have. This has been a really, really wonderful experience. Thank you.
That was me, Peter Moore, talking to David Milne, who works for Relic in Vancouver. We were talking all about Company of Heroes 3, which has been very enthusiastically received indeed. You can see all sorts of visuals and videos, as well as snippets about the original history on our website at tttpodcast.com. That's it from me today. More next week.
All right, let's move out.
Goodbye.